Boa noite a todo mundo. Sejam bem-vindos, bem-vindas ao nosso evento. A gente está fazendo a abertura oficial do SBAC Online 2021 e o tema desse nosso evento é Morcegos do Sul Global. Então, essa é uma iniciativa de tentar fortalecer e dar mais visibilidade a toda a pesquisa e todos os pesquisadores que trabalham com morcegos no Hemisfério Sul, né? Essa é uma primeira experiência nossa de tentar fazer um evento internacional com a participação de vários pesquisadores internacionais. E hoje a gente conta com uma participação bastante especial, que é a Susan Tsang. A Susan, ela é uma pesquisadora associada ao Museu de História Natural, Museu Americano de História Natural dos Estados Unidos, e ao Museu de História Natural, Museu Nacional de História Natural das Filipinas, né? Ela também tem uma consultoria chamada Biodiversitas Global, e ela trabalha há alguns anos com a sua pesquisa focada na questão das raposas voadoras, das flying foxes, no Sudeste Asiático, e mais especificamente hoje ela vai falar para a gente de um aspecto bastante importante de uma pressão que esses animais experimentam, que é a caça e o tráfico das raposas voadoras, né? Então essa é uma questão que ela é bastante preocupante e impactante para a fauna de morcegos, de raposas voadoras no Sudeste Asiático. Então é com muito prazer e muita honra que a gente convida a Susan para fazer a palestra dela. Conforme eu combinei com ela, eu ia fazer essa pequena introdução em português, vou fazer para ela uma pequena introdução em inglês agora, e a gente vai pedir para que as perguntas sejam feitas ao final da sessão. Vocês podem fazer as perguntas de duas formas. Vocês podem fazer as perguntas no chat, ou vocês fazem em inglês e nós repetimos a pergunta para ela em inglês, ou então vocês podem fazer as perguntas em português e a gente traduz para ela ao final da sessão, tá? So please, I'm delighted to have this talk tonight with Susan Tsang. Susan is a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History in the United States and the Philippine National Museum of Natural History. She also has a private consultancy called Biodiversitas Global, and she's a specialist on flying foxes. And tonight she will talk with us about one of the major pressures on flying foxes in Southeastern Asia, the hunting and trafficking. Susan, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and please feel free to give your talk.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I am going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, oh, whoops, that did not do what I thought it would do. Hold on a second. Stop for 1 second. I needed to do that. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to my talk. And today I'm going to talk about flying fox hunting. And that might not be something that people think about a lot for this particular taxa, because that's mostly in the Paleotropics, not the Neotropics. But I think the issues that are salient here are very much something that may be applicable to species that you're more concerned about that are in the Neotropics. So I hope people can take a lot from this in learning about trafficking and what that means and how they can address it in different kinds of situations and circumstances. So in Southeast Asia, hunting is the greatest immediate threat to endangered species. There's been a sharp decline in populations across the board, not just for bats, but for many other vertebrate taxa. And that's mostly because of issues like hunting, because people go out to hunt to eat the animals because they have very low food security, or because people believe that the animals can do things like cure certain diseases, a lot of folk remedies. And even with the protections of things like UNESCO heritage sites, it leads to the empty forest syndrome, which is a perfectly intact, beautiful rainforest, but with no animals in it because people are still going in and taking the animals. And our definition of wildlife trafficking that we're going to work with today is with wildlife trafficking when there's a border crossing and that wildlife is going across that border crossing, that's trafficking. Any sort of illegal collection of wildlife without permits also counts as that. So anything in those categories will be considered trafficking. And it's not just like when people think it's a smuggler bringing in something like a poached tiger, it's any animal that may not be permitted, right? But one of the biggest challenges that we face in studying hunting and addressing hunting is that there's not actually a lot of data that exists. It's a conservation issue that has really only gotten more attention recently. And in law enforcement, it has been something that's been discussed for a very long time, but there's not really been this academic application to understanding it better so that we can actually address it and get a better sense of how to move it forward into the future. And that means all the things that we know about it are based on very few taxa, such as high priority animals like tigers, like elephants, like rhinos. And those focal taxa lead to very specific types of solutions and responses that may not be applicable to all other taxa. When we study trafficking, we try to understand it through the value chain. So globally, the way that people categorize it is to understand where the source country is. You can see that on the right here, and then where they transit through, and then the consumer countries. And that can include all types of people on all sorts of different levels. So the individual poachers, the middlemen that bring them to markets, the logistics for bringing that to middlemen that help them cross to different areas between the source and the consumer. And then on the consumer level, you can have local middlemen there who also sell it for multiple different purposes. For bats or any other animal, we can really just simplify this in economic terms to be supply, transit, and demand. And how we address those issues are going to be very key in looking at how supply and demand works. So on the supply side, we have to really increase political will to actually address the issue on local, national, or international levels, and to actually increase the level of enforcement, because you can have laws that exist but are not enforced enough to actually protect the animals. And you can also improve the rule of law. And what we mean by rule of law are things like having criminal investigations that actually get carried out, having lawyers actually prosecute the crimes, and then also sentencing criminals in a way that is actually effective in reducing and suppressing and basically decreasing the desire for people to commit that crime. On the demand side, which is more difficult part often, we really want to try to understand why is it that the wildlife is being consumed and increase the consumer awareness of the impact of what they're consuming on wildlife and on biodiversity and on themselves. We have to create activities, though, that are actually directly impacting this consumer behavior. That can be very difficult because some of those studies are very long-term and very involved, and there are very few tools that are applicable across the board. And so they are worthwhile studies to do, but as I go through in this talk, you'll see how sometimes that might be a little bit difficult, and we have to work very hard to address them. So where I work mostly on this issue is Indonesia. And so this is a map to give a general idea of where everything is. And most people know of Java and Sumatra because that's very well known for rhinos and orangutans and elephants and tigers. And then Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian name for Borneo. Borneo is the entire island. Kalimantan is the Indonesian side. We do a lot of work there also on rhinos and other large taxa like that. But then once you start getting to the eastern part of Indonesia, like Sulawesi, Maluku, which historically were the colonial spice islands from the Dutch, and Irian Jaya, which is the western half of Papua New Guinea, we end up seeing that there are fewer and fewer of these very large animals like tigers and elephants and rhinos. And sometimes the only large animals there are flying foxes. And in some cases, they have macaques and these more medium-sized monkeys. But at the same time, we really are dealing, we're really not dealing with primates. We're really dealing with just big bats as the only animals out there. And part of this is because these islands have never been on a continent. They are islands that have risen out of the ocean, and the only taxa that are native to there are animals that were able to somehow have dispersed into those areas. In most of those cases that are large animals, they are bats. And in a lot of these places, people eat bats for different reasons. So in Sumatra and Java, they eat them as medicine. People believe that the liver is actually the center of the body, not the heart, not the brain or anything else. And instead, they will take the bat and they will eat the liver to cure things like asthma or just as a general cure-all. In places like Borneo, Sulawesi, and Papua, people have very low food security. And so they actually hunt the bats as just regular subsistence hunting. And that's increased over time as populations have risen and as people have immigrated more and more all over Indonesia. In the Lesser Sundas, which is down here, all the little islands, which include Bali and also in Maluku, people eat them with alcohol. And these are islands where there are not many Muslim populations. These are islands where historically, for instance, in Maluku, there's more Christians. In the Lesser Sundas, you still have a lot of people that are Hindu or Buddhist or other religions besides Islamic. And so people still drink alcohol. And when they do, they actually eat the bats kind of like peanuts with alcohol, beer, snacks kind of things. And people are going out there and collecting these bats in very different ways because you have bat populations that are not really formed in the same way. So on the upper left, you see this big colony of flying foxes, and they're all in these trees together. And so people will just set up these large poles and put nets in between them, and they'll just let the bats run into the nets. And in the morning, you see on the bottom left there, they will lower the pole, and they'll just take the bats off of the hooks and the nets and everything and sell them at the market. On the right side, that is a photo from Sumatra, where instead of going after the colonies, because people don't really know where they are, they will actually find bats near areas where they forage, and they will fly a kite into the air and basically run the kite into the bat, and the bat will crash onto the ground, and that's how people hunt them individually. And that is usually done on a ordering basis. So somebody will say like, oh, my child needs some medicine. Can you go get one for me? But we're going to focus on Sulawesi. And the reason for that is because the level of consumption there is one that is just multitudes higher than everywhere else in Indonesia. In Sulawesi, that's where you often see these pictures of people who went to the market, and there are piles of bats there. There are bats that are already cooked. They are already, the wings are already taken off, and they are already stripped of the fur from burning. Or you can even buy bats that are already butchered, which is on the upper right. Or you can find bats that have been killed and are being waited for processing, and you can buy them almost fresh and cooked right there. And you can even see other rare animals being sold at these markets too. So it's not just bats. There are the black-crested macaque, which most people know because it was the first animal to take a selfie of itself. There are forest rodents, which are everything from rodents that we have never even identified in science yet to the ones that we find very commonly. And couscous, which are these marsupials that are, they call them like tree kangaroos in Australia. And there are a radiation of them in Sulawesi, in eastern Indonesia, that are very large and very slow. And so they're very easy to capture once they are out of the tree because they are arboreal animals that are not very capable of walking and running away on the ground. These markets are called extreme markets, and they have been marketed very recently by these tourism pamphlets like, Lonely Planet and any of the online ones even, to tell foreign tourists to go visit them as some sort of like, cultural touch point or something. And because of that, it kind of encouraged this behavior beyond just the local consumption. It's now for an audience also to some degree. So when I lived in Indonesia, or in my Fulbright, I worked with one of my Indonesian students, Scheherazade, Sarah, and we actually looked to see how can we understand these networks of bushmeat markets in North Sulawesi, because that's where it was concentrated. If you look here on this map I have on the left, you will see that the percentage there actually are where the bats are coming from, because all of these animals that are in North Sulawesi, where the inset is here, that's where the markets are, but that's not where the bats are. The bats have locally been extirpated there already. So people have to now source them from other provinces, and in some cases, even from other islands. The 6% from Kalimantan is actually because of the fact that there are hunters that go out there and hunt large babi rusa, these wild pigs, and they sometimes end up capturing bats, and they sell them in Sulawesi instead because they know there are people that will want them. But you get a lot of the bats instead from other provinces in Sulawesi, where there's still very large colonies that are very well known, and that the people locally there don't actually consume the bats because they're either Muslim, or because they believe the bats are sacred in some way, or because there are some people that are fruit farmers and fruit sellers, and they depend on the bats to actually pollinate the plants, and so they know to not go bother them. And so there's very different reasons in many places, but in North Sulawesi, it's a level of concentration that is unheard of anywhere else. And when you talk to people, they think it's okay, because to them, they only see what is in the market, and therefore they think the population is stable and it's okay to keep eating them. So they don't really act to address them, and they're very unaware of the amount of bats that are coming in from other places. all of these bats being from other provinces is an issue because now it's increasing that problem everywhere else and not just in North Sulawesi. And when we actually went out to survey why people ate the bats, we found out that the demand was driven by Christian holiday celebrations. And that's because this province of North Sulawesi historically is a province that was extremely influenced by Dutch colonization. And the rest of Sulawesi was more impacted by these expansion of Islamic religion that was prior to that. So people don't eat them in other provinces because it's not halal. So the dense concentration of Christians then want to maintain this level of identity separation and eat the bats for that reason. And so that means the church is actually a very important institution for us to work with in order to do bat conservation. And these institutions, these older cohorts really trust these types of institutions more than they trust biologists, even an Indonesian biologist that comes in to talk to them. And the great thing about working with Sarah, though, is that even though she was Muslim before, her family is originally from Sulawesi. So they really trust her a lot, being someone who is also local and being someone that they know has their best interests in mind also, and that wants everybody to come together to work together so that we don't, depopulate the population of bats and end up hurting the rest of the forest or hurting the rest of society in some way. So we talked to them to try to get them to act as local enforcers or local educators, and having people come together during holidays and having the church talk to people to either cap the amount of consumption so that we can decrease the rate of depopulation of the bats in that area. And when we went out and talked to people about where is it that these hunting events are actually happening, we interviewed people in these provinces where hunting is very high. And we knew kind of where people had said historically there were roosts, and we went to survey them. Are there actually roosts there? And found out, yes, there are. No, there aren't. But then we also talked to people to say, do they hunt them there? Do they not hunt them there? And we end up getting a map. And by knowing where exactly the hunting happens, we know where to concentrate our attentions and our resources and understand those people better so that we can try to address the issue. So in our study of a value chain, we know that from the supply side, it's usually from these hunters that are not from those provinces. They're usually from North Sulawesi, and they're local middlemen. They'll go and get hunters who are local that know things better and hunt them. And they don't pay them very much money. They only give them something around 8,000 Indonesian rupiah, which is about 50 US cents to buy a single bat. And then they will just buy many, many bats. Then they will give it to somebody else to drive it in a car up to the north part of Sulawesi, and they will then sell them to the vendors. And by the time it even gets to the vendor, it increases only to about $3.50. And the buyers pay anywhere from about $5 to $6 for a single bat, and that's it. The increase in price it's a small increase, but it's still more and more and more. And you'll see that in those value chains, the product obviously increases in price. But compared to something like a tiger or a rhino or anything that's a big ticket item, where the supply side, you might not pay the hunter that much, the increase at the end for the demand is significantly higher. And that's partially why people don't pay attention to the bat trade as much, even though the volume of them is very alarming and to the point where it is threatening extinction at a much faster rate. So in order to address these issues, we try to work with what's called theory of change. And theory of change is a framework for guiding how you want to engage with your local community and make it so that you can get policymakers and practitioners to change things that lead to more long-lasting changes. It's a change in community action that disincentivizes illegal behavior. It incentivizes wildlife stewardship. It decreases the cost of living with wildlife. So in the case when we talk about things like predators, decreasing the cost of living with a carnivore that is a predator to people who might be afraid of being preyed upon or afraid of their goats being preyed upon or things like that. And also to support livelihoods of these people unrelated to actually wildlife consumption. And this is a model that has worked often with people who work with NGOs like RARE, where they go out and they try to understand the population and what goes on in that population and that community more before they actually decide what they should choose to do to address it. And that gets you the conservation results of protecting the animals. And sometimes those answers are not super direct. When we talk about disincentives for illegal behavior, the first thing we talk about is legal frameworks for it. And that is something that is very weak in Indonesia and that we have to build all the time. And that is something that I worked on when I was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to try to do either by training people at the level of at the Attorney General office or even people at the police officer level to know to go arrest somebody. So that can vary depending on the situation. The other three things, though, are all related to trying to focus on what is it that you want for your conservation outcome. And you can't do that unless you understand the community. So we spent time and money and effort to go out and talk to people and survey people. And nurturing that sense of community is really important because what you get is a sense of ownership by the local folks, and then they end up doing better governance and more action to address the issue itself. So this is an example of a meeting that we held with the local community leaders and included some of the local NGOs to get them to actually give us input about what they were working on, how they related to this issue, and then also for us to impart information on them about the global picture and then how it fits together with everybody. And this was a program that was also supported by the national level, the Indonesian Institute of Science, which is the national research arm of the government, and also the Ministry of Forestry and the Natural Resource Department. And all of them came and also gave their input and how they can better support that action as well. On an even more local level, we went out to the villages, the most local level that you can get in contact with. And we talked to the stakeholders at those levels in the district government, in the village government, the fishermen in between those places, the farmers in between those places. We gathered the village representatives. We brought together people from nature clubs who cared about what the environment was like. And we brought together a lot of younger people also who really cared about the future of their community and what that landscape looked like. And on top of that, we really leveraged the importance of women in taking care of things like waste management and family health, because those factors are actually really tied to biodiversity and natural health also. And they learned a lot from us about how is it that they can make choices that will benefit their ability to, give more food security to their children or give healthier lifestyles to their children by also supporting biodiversity. And this really empowered them to act. And this they did through the formation of this local NGO from my colleague Mbak Asnin called Progress. Progress is actually an acronym in Indonesian, and it basically helps people focus on an organization that can give them the resources and the knowledge to do things like sustainable planting, to do revitalization of the soil using sustainable products, and all kinds of things that will be better for their families overall, which is what they cared a lot about, but also worked very well with our goals with biodiversity management. We also did one of the most important things actually for flying fox protection, which is dedicated roost protection. So in order to decrease the desire for people to come and hunt the bats, we increased the presence of people on the ground. And we created community partnerships that encourage people to go and protect the bats. So the bat colony is on the central part of this island that is actually off the shore of the mainland. And on the beach there, we set up this observation tower. We sent an architect to build it. It's very strong. It's built purposely to be able to withstand typhoon winds of a certain level. There's a telescope up there so they can check out how the colony is doing and also identify the species that are in the tree and also do counts from this particular tower. And they can stay there overnight also in some cases when they need to. And this really helped decrease hunters going there because now they know there's always a person there. They can't just get away with sneaking in behind the village chief and stealing all the bats there and selling them in another province. When we looked at how successful we were, even a year only after we started the program, we saw a significant decrease in hunting activity. And that's the point of even not finding garbage on the ground, like old hooks or old nets or people's flip-flops that got left back behind. And there were fewer dead bats that were just under trees. And we saw that the bats were pretty healthy and the populations were growing actually over time. In that increase, even in the first year, and I have more data that's even more recent than this too, we saw an increase of the bat population starting at 300 to even up to 35,000. And the fluctuations that existed in between that time tend to be the seasonal drifts and not just like the bat population growing. And we saw flying foxes from other parts of Sulawesi now start to also come here because they know that this site is protected and they can live in peace. And now we're trying to expand the study, obviously, to take this monitoring on further to understand those seasonal cycles better, what kinds of diets do they have, and also getting a better sense of the landscape level and not just on our single roost. In the community level, we helped establish a lot of the sustainable development projects that they cared about. So when we talked to them, they said, we want to develop ecotourism. We want to develop a village that is following these UN SDGs, but at the same time, we don't know how to do it. And so they started with something very simple that could implement the manpower of everybody in the village, which was beach cleaning. So you noticed there was a lot of garbage coming in from the tides that were from either surrounding islands or from other parts of the island that were washing up in areas that were very important for turtles coming in, even not bats even, and were places that were very key to just being able to regrow crops and regrow trees that were native and regrowing the wetlands and the mangroves. And we expanded that further to also greening projects. So looking at those mud flats where there are no trees, they used to be wetlands that were very lush mangroves. And so we brought in plants to help with regrowing there. We brought in plants to help regrow in front of people's houses in the village that are native fruit species that might be very interesting to the flying foxes. So it also gives them a food source. And we provided information on a regular basis on the village board. So we erected this that has a standing poster that informs people about the bats, but it has a space also for us to give them updates and to give them any notice about activities that are coming up and really keep people involved and knowing that we are an active presence. And we've been training people on how to actually do ecological research on their own. So please excuse the fact that these photos are from pre-COVID, so people don't have the face mask on because we didn't really wear that beforehand. But now, please follow the IUCN guidelines and wear a face mask when handling bats that closely. We taught people about how these bats are very much tied to the ecosystem services of pollination and seed dispersal. And so one of the projects that they've went out to do is trying to better understand that. And that means they will go out and collect pollen. They will also go out and track the reproductive cycle of the bats, because then you can take the bat, identify what phase in that reproductive cycle they're in and create a calendar that better understands when they happen and therefore give more protection to bats during vulnerable parts of the cycle, such as when, females are very pregnant or they just gave birth. And so they're very weak immunologically. And in those cases, really don't let people get too close to those colonies and prevent people from interacting with the bats in a way that stresses them out even more and could cause negative interactions between bats and humans. And for us, this aspect of ecosystem services is really key because economically, they are a big contributor to plants like durian. And durian is the big spiky fruit that's very smelly. It's delicious, by the way. And it's also something that is a cash crop in Southeast Asia for the region. So having that cash crop being something that requires bats because they cannot self-pollinate means that the bat population has to be healthy if the plant population is also to be healthy. At the same time, you also have bats being very important, especially for these ecologically important species like ficus or like the other early successional plants that are very necessary to making that soil more palatable towards more mature growth plants and breaking down any sort of, sandy and rocky parts of the shore that are not great right now, and just helping regrow basically in areas that have been completely deforested. So they have dual purposes in what they do in that pollination and seed dispersal aspect, but also in just even keeping the genetic diversity of the plant population interconnected across the entire island and not just in isolated pockets. And they are some of the only animals able to do that because of the fact that they are very capable of migrating and dispersing over very large areas without stopping. In the study of durian specifically, and this was part of Sarah's master study, there was a higher fruit set of durian that was associated with visitation by the flying foxes. So here, the list here, the top one is a smaller bat, a smaller fruit bat that is very well known in Thailand to be the most important visitor for durian. But because the assemblage of bats is very different in the island parts of Indonesia compared to the continental parts of Southeast Asia, we knew that there was very big likelihood that something else was actually contributing to it, especially because in Sulawesi, there are many more species of flying foxes. So the two species you see here on the bottom are the two largest flying fox species that are known in Sulawesi, and they contribute significantly to how successful the durians are for fruit set. If you look at this graph, we did these exclusion experiments that had closed pollination. So, there's a net that was set around the entire flower, so nothing can get in. There was insect pollination that was allowed. So the holes were big enough that the insects can still go in, but the bats can't. And there was just open pollination where all the bats can get at the flowers and freely visit them. And we found that these durian really needed the bats. And it was very interesting because that was something that people were not aware of completely. And in having this very clear story where the bats were very important pollinators for durian, we made a poster that we can then bring out to people and open from the perspective of, do you love durian? And for most Southeast Asian, the answer is yes. It's delicious and it's very culturally important. And so in describing how the bats play into the life cycle of pollination and the pollination ecology of durian, we are able to then get people to think of the bats also as culturally important as touchstones and also want to protect them. And so this poster is freely available to anybody if they want to take a look later. There is the English under the Indonesian on the poster for anyone interested. And we have a paper also that was published for that. And then we also did a lot more capacity building in the local villages. So previously, when I mentioned the youth communities and the nature groups, we also actually encouraged them to lead and initiate projects of the sort, not only from the sustainable development side, not only for the science side, but also just community level projects. And we trained them not only in science, but also on these really important professional development skills and administrative skills. And that made them capable of being leaders in their own right of other projects that they might have imagined that we could not work on. So now they know how to do their own finances. They know how to go out and manage their own projects. They can then spread out the sustainable development happening to other parts of that province and then slowly build on that to a wider and wider community. We went back in talking to some of these government officials, though, from the Indonesian Institute of Science, from the Ministry of Forestry, from the Natural Resource Department, and had workshops that were then sharing what we found in our experience in working on the ecosystem services and also about hunting, and then really discuss that urgency with them and what types of research and conservation programs need to happen in order to then address that, given what we knew from our work out there. And in those workshops, we also then trained local universities to do similar types of surveys that we did in order to get a more comprehensive picture of what happens on local scales in all of these places, because we knew there were very fine-grained levels of differences due to people's religion or access to resources or familiarity with bats. From these meetings, we had outputs like another list of known roost sites for flying foxes and where they were hunted. So that expanded our knowledge outside of the provinces that we didn't get to work in. And we also got a sense of what are the current flying fox research and conservation programs, like where are people working already, and who is it that we can then tap into to be collaborators and tap into to share our results with and see if it applies in other places also. The workshop participants, all can benefit from this by having a better understanding about the level and severity of bushmeat hunting overall on the island and overall in Indonesia, and the importance of flying foxes and how that impacts them and what they care about. For the village chiefs, they learned a lot about flying foxes. They, never really had the chance to do a lot of this type of science education and environmental education. And a lot of them commented very enthusiastically about wanting to actually do flying fox conservation as a result of that. So they took the step to formalize things like hunting bans. Hunting bans often used to exist on a very informal level as a community restriction, but that community restriction was not really a formal law or a formal rule in any way. And now they're going to formalize it into what's called adat, which is a community law. And that results in community-based conservation that can then expand once that adat is created. The university students, they get a lot of experience in doing research and doing practical conservation, and then being able to work with different stakeholders. A lot of times the students don't get opportunities to get access to, government officials or even to folks on a government officials and scientists also even on a national level. They only get restricted to their local scientists or their local government officials. And there's that hierarchy that exists between students that sometimes makes it difficult for them to get to those levels of people. And we help facilitate that ability for them to work together and to communicate and share with each other. And that's something that they have a very difficult time getting for cultural and hierarchical reasons that would maybe not be something that exists in all cultures, but is something that we did have to address directly. From what we found, we created this theory of planned behavior. So this is part of the understanding of the theory of change. We had to understand the base level of this behavior of eating bats and this, behavioral intention that I intend to eat bats, and then addressing the attitudes that people have about eating bats being good for them or feeling the social pressure and the subjective norm to eat bats, And just having us have laws that can control behaviors like, if they know that they can eat them, they will go eat them. And then we get a list of these beliefs and motivations. And you can actually do this for almost any conservation issue you have and plug in all of these things into the different slots. If you read Tigges' chapter in the Bats of the Anthropocene book, there is a explanation for how to do this, and the chapter is open access on Springer. So I encourage folks to look at that if they're interested in conservation and long-term conservation planning and addressing any sort of issue. The area that we focused on a lot, though, after we've actually gone out and done the study, is this attitude about eating bats being good for people, good, quote unquote, and doing outreach to address it. Because for us, that was one of the more obvious places that we can impact them. In doing that, we went out and reached out to younger children for doing basic environmental education, which is something that was severely lacking in the way that the current education system is built. So that's children who are from the age of like 7 to 14 and working with primary education and schools on the middle school level even. So the study that we did was not just from us, but also in collaboration with Tasikoki Wildlife Rescue Center, with Wendy, and Wendy was the one who went out and did this education. She has a lot of experience working with children. And she went out to all the 4 major cities where there are bushmeat markets and went to these schools and targeted these children in order to do a little class. And the activity itself is only about 2 hours. They do an icebreaker. They fill out this consumption board, which I'll show you in a second. They take a little pre-test kind of to see where the kids are understanding in terms of the environment. They teach about the bats, but using a storytelling method so that it's easier for the children to understand. And then they do a post-test to see if their intervention of education has done something directly to impact the way that the children think. So the consumption board looks something like this, where it's just for a month. Here's the week 1, 2, 3, 4, and there are some stickers where they can just put where when they ate something. And so there's everywhere from chicken or babirusa or pork or bats or cows or vegetables or mice, or eggs. There's anything that could be on people's diets. And then the pretest is very simple. It's just asking really simple questions about if they knew like what a forest was and how the forest impacts them, if they can identify certain endemics that are very well known to scientists, and that are iconic to the island, and if they can actually understand that these are animals that are in their own backyard. And this was kept very simple because the children are very young, and we wanted to be able to actually get them to answer the questions. And if you ask something that's too complicated and it's outside their vocabulary range, they can't do anything about it. So some other questions that we had were things like, circle which animal is a flying fox, and like illustrate how it benefits the forest and how it benefits people. And we let them illustrate it because, children might not know words like pollination, especially when they're, in 7th grade and have never had environmental education before. And we just kind of wanted to get a sense of their eating habits at home also. So we kind of left a understanding of if they liked the different types of meat or not. And that's to really try to understand if there was another more subjective connection between why people ate the bats or other foods. From what we did, we also had this nice little poster about flying foxes. And this was just to teach people about the bats. And this was given out at all of the different schools. This is actually also online on the website for the NGO Progress, and you can download it if you want. There is Indonesian and there's English on it. And it teaches people about how the bats relate to the forest and the durian, again, in a way that connects to something people care about. And our local collaborator, Mbak Anim, also wrote this story about the bats and the durian. And it's to communicate how it is that the bats are connected to people and are very similar to us. So in the story, it actually talks about how bats are mammals, how bats have babies that are also going to drink milk, and how the bats also have family groups, and basically ways for people to connect with the bats on a more empathetic level and not just only in a scientific one. In the post-assessment, we gave the same test, and then we compared the results of the pre and the post to see if the storytelling had any impact on the children. In what we did with the outreach, we found that in all these districts, the flying foxes were the most frequently consumed compared to other wild meats. And that level might seem like a small percentage, but even so, it's a number that tells us that there is clearly more access to it and more people consuming the bats because of that. And in understanding how the bats benefit the forest, there was a significant increase after we did the education. It was very noticeable and very obvious, as you can see here. And how the flying foxes benefit the people, though, that was spread across a wider variation, but it was still a significant increase. So even though it was only, let's say, like about half the children who understood much better that the bats benefit people, it's still an increase that lets us know that it worked in some way, and we can improve on that to get a larger percentage to understand that beneficial relationship. When we talked to them, though, about the eating bats after the outreach, though, it improved that understanding, like I showed you, but it didn't really do anything about consumption. And part of the reason is because, and this was obviously not what you would want to see, right? The outreach didn't promote the expected behavior, which is preventing the kids from eating bats. It's still low bat consumption, but it's higher compared to other bushmeat like rodents and monkeys. And that's because we need to understand other factors that are impacting this. So improving understanding doesn't lead to attitude change. And that's something that I often try to remind people, that knowledge transfer without any other action doesn't necessarily lead to the conservation outcome that you want. And that attitude change is really essential for if you want that behavior change. Part of it, one, is that they didn't eat the bats the entire month because of the information received during the outreach. But, and it's still important, but like the barrier is really that children don't get to choose what they eat. They have to just eat whatever is delivered to them sometimes. And they may not have communicated what they learned to their parents back home. And so they may not have transmitted that new knowledge to people that have power to decide what to do. And sometimes children just forget and they don't remember to transmit that information to other parties. And so one way that we can try to improve on how we do this is target parents more, or in particular mothers who have the authority to decide what goes on the meal table. In doing that, we can create activities like children-mother conservation days. We bring them together to come learn with their child. And again, I know I said this before, but again, awareness raising alone is insufficient. So anytime you want to get people to have sustained behavioral change, you need to find concrete ways to address where the gaps are and create an activity that gets at those gaps. So going back to this idea of, what were the supply and demand things I talked about earlier? How can we address these issues? I think that I've kind of gone through them one by one, but you will have to see that all of them always come together. You can't do one without the other. And sometimes that's very difficult, but if you try to build a model like that for behavior change, and the theory of planned behavior also, you can try to at least fill in these gaps slowly and be able to address them. I do encourage people to look at other examples of bat hunting too, because it isn't something that is done very often. And my colleagues in Southeast Asia and in the South Pacific have worked on this to a great extent because we have flying foxes in all these areas. Sherry Paz in the Philippines is working on flying foxes that are being hunted in Agusan Marsh, and that's for people who don't have access to other forms of food. Versus like in the northern Philippines, where there are miners that hunt the flying foxes for sport because they're bored when they have nothing to do. In Rimba in peninsular Malaysia, they have a lot of conflict between the bats and the farmers that are farming things like, fruits that are being sold commercially, and the farmers mistaken sometimes the bats as being the sole contributor to, eating their fruits and other things like that and damaging the crops. And so they persecute them by actively going after the bats. In places like Northeast India, you have people who are going out as part of these traditional hunting festivals, and they are harvesting them also as medicine. And that exposes them to all kinds of emerging infectious diseases. And so Pilot is studying that right now in Nagaland. Malik in New Caledonia is studying traditional hunting and harvest of flying foxes. And he's put out a couple papers recently to try to measure how much that's happening. And Tyrone Lavery is working in the Solomons on flying fox teeth as cultural currency and using that historical component and cultural component to try to get people to understand how it is impacting the population now and why they need to protect it. And a lot of people, worried how much bat hunting was going to be interacting with this part of COVID, which will make things even worse. And in some cases in Indonesia, we saw that, this is actually from a news report. This was a clip from a video, actually. I don't think I can get it to play properly here. But the bats themselves were purposely then taken from the market, and the government purposely killed them even beforehand. And it led to a lot of persecution in places where people were eating them and they were going after the bats. And we had to do a lot of active campaigning and policy brief writing to different government agencies to try to get them to understand that it's first of all, it's not these bats. And second of all, the way that they're going about this is not going to prevent COVID from spreading, because COVID is not from these bats. It's from people transmitting to each other at this point. And that happened in a lot of countries, disappointingly, when COVID started, and has decreased in the past year thanks to the efforts of a lot of bat biologists globally who have worked with government officials and with local communities to get them to better understand what is going on. I'm going to play this and you can see. So they actually went out and took the cages and gassed the bats, basically, and let people just kill a bunch of them. You can actually look this up to watch the entire thing later on the South China Morning Post. But I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's quite upsetting. Okay, so in order to try to mitigate these negative impacts, like I mentioned, a lot of us went out during these past couple of years to talk to people and do more science communication to decrease misconceptions about bats, especially because people were trying to cull them and really get them to understand that culling does not reduce disease risk. We have examples of this with vampire bats, with rabies in Peru, for instance. And it's just explaining to people better, what does it mean when we say a bat is a natural reservoir host? And in getting at these issues, the Global Bat Net, of which I am one of the executive PIs on, have created a lot of short explainer posts in English about, what does it mean when we say a bat has a 96%, similar coronavirus in it compared to COVID? What does it mean when we talk about landscape issues being more of an impacting factor on the spread of emerging infectious diseases? Like, we have lots of little explainer articles that I encourage people to go read and get a better sense of if they're not familiar with the topics or want to share with other people who want to learn. And we're trying to update them as often as possible as research comes in, because I know there's a lot of new papers that come out and not all of them have equal quality. So, I always encourage people to go out there. And if anyone has any interest in contributing anything, I'm perfectly happy to work with them on that. And so with that, I really want to thank everybody who I've worked with. A lot of this was work I've done recently, but also from my PhD work. And so it's a combination of all sorts of funding sources and experiences. And if anybody wants to learn more about Progress, their website is www.poniki.id, and they have an Instagram on Progress Sulawesi. This NGO is very much a locally formed NGO that I really would love if people supported them and helped them grow. And in the past year and a half, they've grown so much that now they're also working on 2 other critically endangered threatened taxa that do not get enough attention: the Forston green turtle and the Sulawesi cuscus, the bear cuscus. And I really wish that more people would, show them some love, give them some support on social media and things like that, and encourage them. And if anybody has any questions for me, feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. And that's it. Thanks.
Well, congratulations. This is an outstanding project. It's an amazing diversity of approaches and very, very stimulating. Thank you very much for your talk. We are going now to open for questions. We have already a lot of questions on the YouTube. I'm going to read and translate some of those questions. The first one comes from Dennis Sana, and he's asking, is there any practical action trying to make the population to substitute the financial resources they obtain from selling flying foxes, for example, like ecotourism involving bats? Is that possible?
Yes. So for us, our local populations themselves actually do not really get very much in terms of economic gain from the hunters coming. The hunters are external for the most part. And the only thing that they do to the local people is ask them, where are the bats? How can we get there? And then that's it. They don't even pay the boatman to go there sometimes. They just somehow sneak on the island and steal all the bats and just run away with a bag of bats. So sometimes it doesn't even benefit some of the local people at all. It's external actors that are benefiting from the hunting of the bats. And the local people culturally actually feel very badly about this, because some of them have expressed enjoyment of watching the bats emerge every night, and now they don't see them because the hunters came and scared all the bats away. And so they don't have this wonderful part of their life anymore, and they didn't know why at many points. And so when we talk to them about, like, it's from the hunting, it disturbs the bats so they don't come back for several months, and it's not just a seasonal thing, then they understood that if they stopped the hunters from going, then the bats wouldn't leave. In other cases, in other areas, though, there are examples where ecotourism was very helpful to protecting the bats. And those examples are in the Philippines, actually. I encourage people to look up the work of the Philippine Biodiversity and Conservation Inc., PBCFI. They actually have gone out and gotten private lands from people that have bat roosts on them, and gotten the private owners to sign agreements that said, we will not develop this land, we will not disturb the bats here. This is an ecotourism object that is local, to allow people to visit them, and gave a model for how to monetize that, to give incentive to the local population. And it can't happen in isolation, though. It has to happen as a larger framework of people that want to go to that area for ecotourism. So it becomes one object on like an ecotourism trail of things that they can see. So they also help manage, let's say, these caves that have really interesting cave bats that needed protection. And that was part of a trail of ecotourism objects. And so that's why it has to end up being a regional effort and not just a single object. And understanding that landscape helps you better be able to plan for things like that. In other cases, there were also places in Indonesia where ecotourism, having the bat colony there, was a really good ecotourism object, but the attraction was also that landscape being a coral reef that was very beautiful. And so convincing people to protect that area, to not allow for not only hunters to come in, but other types of disturbance, is beneficial to that entire area and not just the one thing. And then helping them understand that all these animals are connected, terrestrial and marine are connected in terms of disturbance that happens to them, so that the ecotourism is not targeted only at a single actor, but to everybody in that community, and encourage them to then actually act to protect it. So there's different cases on different levels depending on the situation, but often there are ways to substitute that. And for us also, even just building more educational opportunities for young people in learning science and learning how to manage projects and do finances gave them the opportunity to seek jobs that they could not do so otherwise. And so it made them more competitive for the general job market and not just specifically to ecotourism. And that just made them care more about nature, because that's where they learned how to do these things in the first place.
Okay. One more question is from Hernani Oliveira. Thank you for the great talk, Susan. Is climate change an important threat for flying foxes in Indonesia, such as they can be for them in Australia, for example?
Yes, so we are currently, we're not at the level of Australia where we saw those mass die-offs, which often actually come from starvation also, not just from those heat waves, but many of the bats coming down because the forest around them has burned down. There's no more food source anywhere near them, and they all end up starving to death. We haven't seen that yet in Indonesia, but it might get to that point. And mostly that's because the bat populations are going further and further away from these mainland islands that are being developed. But as those places are becoming less and less available, or the bats are moving to more remote islands, there is the possibility of sea level rise happening to the point where there are no more mangroves and large, safe roosting areas for the bats. And it's a really big problem because those roosting sites are very essential to the long-term health of the bat populations. If they have to migrate to somewhere where the roosting site is suboptimal, then that means that they can get closer to conflict with humans and people can hunt them easier, and all kinds of things that waste their energy and resources. And so we don't know to what extent that it's impacting the flying foxes yet, but we do know it is an issue that is coming up, and it's especially true of the island species that are endemic to single islands, of which there are many in Southeast Asia, and especially in Indonesia.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. Hernani, once again, in the Mariana Islands, there has been a neurological disease that has been potentially linked to the habit of eating flying foxes. Do you know any disease that people who eat the bats in Indonesia?
I don't think anyone has actually studied that in Indonesia before, though I know which one you're talking about for the Marianas. I don't think people have studied that before. So I don't think that's ever been documented. And even for other like infectious diseases that people have paid more attention to, like Ebola virus and other filoviruses, that's never really been recorded either in Indonesia. That is an aspect of the disease ecology that I've been working on with folks from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which works on functional genomics and basically what functional factors exist in the host genome that allow for the pathogen of any sort, a parasite or a virus even to come in to infect the host. And we've basically found that there's a lot of flying foxes where there are genomic mechanisms that make it not possible to infect them with certain viruses. And so we're trying to understand that factor right now. But I don't really know if anybody else is studying those types of things in Indonesia yet.
Okay. We had a couple questions about if is it already possible to evaluate the impact of the COVID on the consumption of bats, or if it's still too early to evaluate that.
I think that overall we can't do that yet because in Indonesia, COVID as a spreading epidemic is still happening. Eh, when the pandemic first started, actually, my student Sarah, who I showed the picture of earlier, she has asthma, and so I was very worried for her. And she lived in West Java, where all the concentrated cases were. And so her going to our site in Sulawesi was actually safer because it was a green zone; it had no cases or anything. And so she stayed there for a year and a half almost, and she was fine. But then 2 months ago, we got a notice from our field team that said that the first cases had popped up in that city, in that village, and it was just, spread everywhere almost immediately. Unfortunately, everyone in our field team is okay, but that time gap in when people think the peaks are very different in different places. And it's also part of why I have not done any field work in the past year and a half in Indonesia, because it's very easy for people who travel to bring COVID and strains of COVID into these little pockets in Indonesia, and having those strains then evolve into their own independent, possibly more virulent strain, and then more negatively impacting people. So as in terms of just ethical, research in these remote places, we really can't be going there when we're coming from highly infectious places. Uh, and yeah, so I don't know, because we can't evaluate it equally across the board for every single island.
Okay. We have one question from Lucas Carneiro. He wants to know what is the role played by local government in this project, if any.
Yeah, so the local government is our major partner. And the first thing we did was go talk to the village chief and tell him what we were doing and be very frank about why we were doing it and how it benefits them, and understanding his perspective. And so our ability to show him the importance of it, and then he really cared about it too, made him say, okay, well, I'm going to make an official, community law that says that people cannot hunt these flying foxes. And we're going to put signs up on the island also to remind people of this. And we are going to keep consistently involved in any development projects and anything that's happening with the NGO, so that we can also give ideas and then also help hold local forums for getting people to give input. So they have been a very large part of it. It's helped really build local ownership over the project and over the work that the local NGO does, and then feeling trust between them so that we can actually do more projects and do more science and do more conservation.
Okay. So now Maria João is congratulating you for the amazing talk, incredible amount of work in so many levels. She was very impressed about the women empowerment, and she had two questions. The first one, what was the biggest challenge you felt when working with the local communities?
I think that for us, it was just making sure that we could get out there to some of these places because they're very remote. I think most of the time, what people ask me about for this is how to really build the trust between the community and the scientists that are coming in. But I was very fortunate that Sarah was there because she is from Sulawesi. Her parents are originally, one of them is Christian, so like they don't treat her as an outsider, even though she was Muslim at the time. And I think that made it very easy for them to like her a lot. If anyone's ever met her, she's extremely charismatic, so everyone likes her instantly, basically. And we were very lucky to have somebody like that. And I think that the challenge then is for us going into any situation to find people who can act as local champions and local communicators that people really can build trust with. And to actually maintain that trust, she had a WhatsApp group with them where she always talked to them, every day, every week practically. And it's just things like joking around and not just, talking about science, to really build that sense of personal friendship also. And for us, that helped a lot in building that trust in almost a less than a year timeline, which is much faster than most other places. And it also obviously helped that I had been working in Indonesia for 5 years at that point already, just overall in Indonesia, not just at that site. And so people knew that even like as a foreigner, me coming in, I was very committed to Indonesia as a whole and not just like popping in and popping out. And, I think my general reputation with her was also very good because I had trained her since she was an undergraduate. And so a lot of people knew that we were very committed to doing good things for other people and not just trying to like take something from them. And that attitude has to be communicated very clearly when you go into any sort of new community. And once we had the local community on our side, kind of, they can act also as communicators to other communities that said, like, you can trust these guys. They went out and they did all this really good work, and and we also really support them. We want to expand this to work with these other places also. And it becomes slowly local to regional, and then hopefully regional then to national. And that's how you're growing and scaling this up in a way that can impact more and more populations in a positive way.
Okay, Maria's second question is, do you think the local communities are now able to recognize and publicize the ecosystem services provided by flying foxes?
For the ones that we've worked with, definitely yes. We actually not only did the ones with the local villages, but also we went to the fruit market, and at night they have these old ladies that all are from different islands, and they all eat durian variants from each of the different islands. And we would sit down in front of them, buy a few durian, and squat on the street, eat with our hands, and talk to them about flying foxes and how they contributed to the durians, in a very casual way. And they're like, oh, that's really interesting. It's like, I never knew that. I'm going to share that with other people. And so we talked to the vendors and actually got the vendors to then also help spread the information to other people that were eating it. Like, oh, I met these nice young ladies who told me about this cool thing, and it's because of the bats. And did you see them over there? We saw one flying there last night, right? So they start telling their own stories also, and it helps spread that positive image and message about the bats. And I think that that's slowly spreading as we also are disseminating information. The children's book that we wrote is freely available online, but we also bring hard copies for people in remote areas that don't have access to easy internet, for instance. And that story was written locally by our local collaborator, and so it's a recognizable animal too. It's not like when you see like the alphabet and all the animals are the African savanna animals that nobody's ever seen in real life. It's really a story that's very much true to their community.
Okay, I have a question. Usually, anthropologists or sociologists, sometimes they are skeptical or even they are negative about this kind of approach when we are trying to change traditional habitats involving eating wildlife or interacting with wildlife in traditional communities or the traditional way of life from some communities. What's your point of view about that?
I think that the idea of what is tradition changes through time, and people need to understand that. So, for instance, like I mentioned with how people hunt them in these Christian areas, it was very core to them identifying them as Christian and separate from the rest of the Muslims. And that distinction didn't always exist there, right? So that tradition existed from a certain period of time and is not integral necessarily to every component of society also. And so whenever people say tradition, they really mean within the past 50 years or so that we remember often. And dissecting that apart from what people's actual core values are in the state of society now, and also in what is core to protecting the animals, is very necessary. Another example of this, as a Chinese person, when people talk about like traditional Chinese medicine, a lot of the traditional booklets that you read from, let's say, 400 years ago are actually plant-based, and medicinal plants are very prescribed. But then all the stuff about like rhino horn for cancer and stuff is from like the 1970s. And so the way that people define tradition usually serves a very conservative, particular hierarchical way that society is created, and not necessarily what is true to tradition. And so really defining what do they mean by tradition and what is the values to that community are more important. And understanding that is not something that you can do overnight, obviously, which is why we would go out and survey and talk to the villagers now so that we understand their values now and not just in a picture book that we see from a colonialist perspective. So I don't really view it as like I have to always see that as that's how things are set. It's the current situation and the current condition of people in those places. And they also are evolving in their mindsets as much as we are. And so we can't always treat it as like they're less than because that's their quote unquote tradition and it doesn't work or whatever. People will change if it says, oh, this is valuable to us at that point because it meant something else. And now we can change our minds. And so our traditions will reflect that in how we change those traditions also.
Okay. I have one more question. Did you detect that the area you studied was a source supplying flying foxes for distant cities or places outside Sulawesi?
No, so Sulawesi seems to be the core consumption area, and it's actually the place that's sucking in bats from other provinces and other islands now even. One thing I didn't show on that map, because it's something that we found more recently in the past like 3 or 4 months, is that there are also other flying foxes now coming from Bali and Lombok that are being imported into Sulawesi. And that's something that people didn't know about before. But the bat species that are in Borneo and also in Bali and Lombok are the same, very large Pteropus vampirus, the largest bats in the world. And they, when they're burned, they look very similar to the black flying fox, Pteropus electa, which is on Sulawesi. So people don't care because they just think it's a flying fox. And it's actually the point of consumption for a lot of places for these bats end up being Sulawesi instead of going elsewhere. It doesn't go internationally either, but because Indonesia is so spread out, it feels almost like it's something that's international in the level of logistics like necessary to do the transport. But CITES doesn't apply because it's not across a transnational boundary. It's only across these provincial boundaries. And so that's why we have to act with the Indonesian government that is a national actor to try to get at some of these more localized issues, because otherwise the natural resource departments are divided by province and they don't talk to each other otherwise. So we have to get them to talk to each other.
The reason why I asked you about that is in September last year, I was surprised by a report called America's Massive Wildlife Imports Fuel Global Pandemic Risks. That report, publicized in the United States, informed that the United States received at least 23 million records of international wildlife coming into the United States, and they are pointing about the high risk of pandemics or diseases, etc. And I was skeptical when I took contact with that report, because they were saying that Brazil was the fourth largest supplier of bats to the U.S. I said that was very, very strange, and I decided.
Oh, sorry.
No, okay.
So partially that there's two things in that. One is, how did they define something as the supplier? And in some cases, it's looking at how the permits are written and that the supply is just the source country that they got the import from. And so it could actually be that sometimes the source country is just a transit country and it's coming in through there. And so for Indonesia, actually, Indonesia is often listed as a source country, but it's also a very high transit country. And that's because the way that the laws are written in Indonesia do not protect anything that is not native. So if somebody were to import African elephant ivory through Indonesia, it is technically not protected under the way that the Indonesian law is currently written, and it acts as a good smuggling point for transit into areas like Vietnam, and then like driving in a car across to China, because it obscures the origin then of it being from Africa. For Indonesia, for bats, though, I spoke specifically about flying foxes here. But to the US, we actually have people who go on eBay and they sell the smaller bats, like the Cynopterus and also Rosetus and also some Myotis, where they mummify them and then they sell them as like these scary looking, Halloween things. But also the very colorful ones like Caravula picta, the painted bat, the Halloween bat that was orange and black, that's originally from Borneo. So a lot of those illegally came in, and people would have these permits that allow them to just have very large volumes of very common bats. But because of the fact that people can't really identify them, especially after they've been mummified to that degree, they sometimes obscure what they're bringing in. The numbers of bats are very high, but we can only get them down to maybe family in some cases. And you can't really do much about it right now because there's no laws protecting them on the Indonesian side for export. And so one of the things that we did do when I was with Fish and Wildlife was work with the Attorney General office and say, what other laws exist that we can then nail these guys on? Because the environmental laws are not strong enough. And so we end up using things like money laundering or smuggling, because smuggling is actually by volume, not by species, and also permitting. And basically other laws that already exist that have penalties attached to them should also be something that is prosecuted for when we are finding these criminals. And right now, if you only try to find them for, they hunted an animal, that might not be sufficient, and it actually doesn't get at the levels of crimes that they are. but some of the people in the legal teams there don't even know that there are laws that can be implemented. And so there are now tools that are being built on many different levels to try to list out all of these laws as a resource. So Legal Atlas, for instance, is online, and you can like click by country and what laws exist, and it helps people better understand what they can maybe apply to when they're trying to prosecute criminals for green crime if green laws don't exist. Yeah, so yeah, the numbers I say it's very heavily dependent on how paperwork is filled out. So it can be very difficult to interpret.
In the case of this report, I was very skeptical when I saw that Brazil was the fourth largest supplier of bats to the USA. And I decided to check the data. So I downloaded the data, and I was surprised. There were 23 million records in the data set, right? And I filtered for Brazil, and there was 5,954 records of bats leaving Brazil and going to the United States. And I said, wow, that's very strange, because I don't know, I'm not aware about why Brazil should be supplying bats to the United States. And then I went deeper to the data set, and I discovered that Eco Health Initiative in Columbia University received 5,935 of those bats. So in fact, those are not bats being trafficked or not being illegally sent to the United States. Those are part of shipments between universities, between a Brazilian university and an American university. And I was quite surprised to see that those reports, those data, that data was inserted in a report about wildlife trafficking.
Well, in those cases, in some cases for research ones, they could have been like temporarily put on those because of things like, oh, they just didn't fill the paperwork correctly. And like later on, they just weren't removed also. Because that's happened with, places from Southeast Asia importing things where somebody had to retroactively fill out their paperwork correctly. So there's a lot of incorrect data in a lot of files for all kinds of different reasons. But some of them is also because of the way that things are listed as sourced in any sort of paperwork. And that can obscure on purpose where those animals are coming from for the purposes of the pet trade, especially. If you look at the global maps for where you see things like monkeys being traded, for instance, for some reason, Spain is a really big importer to the US, right? And that's because there were a lot of people that were able to import things into Spain that were obscured for their origins from Southeast Asia or from Africa. And then it looks like it's a legal, real company that's importing it then to the US that it's not wild caught. So it looks legitimate and then can be sold at places like PetSmart. And you get a lot of this travel of these animals between multiple countries for long periods of time in order to obscure the original source of it and make it look like there's a legitimate supply chain and make it look like that animal was legitimately obtained instead of illegally obtained. So sometimes the way that the data looks is very much based on where exactly and what exactly you're trying to deal with. And that makes the problem very difficult. And that is another one of those challenges with understanding that trafficking chain, right? And that's why I said some of the data, the best quality data we have are for these really high profile animals like chimpanzees or rhinos, where people will use genetics to try to figure out where it came in from that port and where it came from this port and really, really nail down how that even happened in the first place. So that's happening with pangolins right now, where people are creating better tools to source them. So yeah, hopefully we can see that with other animals that are really critically important to ecosystems later on as tools develop better and better. But right now we're still in that infancy with wildlife crime and wildlife forensics. So the lab that I worked with when I was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Wildlife Forensics Lab in Ashland, Oregon, is one of the only wildlife forensics labs in the world. And that's because there's a level of biosecurity and legal security that needs to exist for labs that do wildlife research. And it can't just be like any research scientist does it. It has to be like a secure location. There's chains of custody that are involved that police often have to deal with, that scientists don't have to deal with. And that doesn't exist in places where you can barely even have a research lab. So we're really trying to build that infrastructure right now globally. And that's hopefully going to happen as genetics gets cheaper and more people can get access to portable genetic resources.
Okay, we're coming to an end, and I would like once again to thank you very much for your talk. Very inspiring and very informative about this issue, and very, as I mentioned before, you have different approaches, complementary approaches, which is excellent for inspiring other projects. So thank you very much. And eu gostaria agora de convidar todos vocês que estão assistindo para que vocês também assistam às outras atividades que estão previstas no nosso evento, que vai até sexta-feira. Por favor, visitem o nosso site, sbec.net. Lá a gente tem a programação completa do evento até o final, até na sexta-feira. Susan, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I wish you luck in your next projects. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Bye.